Again, I just want to say good morning and thank you for welcoming here. I've heard so much about your congregation from people within the association, and so I'm just honored to be here, and I appreciate the incredible hospitality that I have already received from so many of you. So I'd like to start this morning with a story, and it is a true story that was given to me by a former congregant. It was near the end of spring. The seats in the local high school auditorium were filled with soon-to-be graduating seniors. The purpose of the assembly was to allow 4 military recruiters, one representing each branch of the U.S. military, to make their pitch to the students as to why they should enlist out of high school and why they should choose their specific branch of the military. The first recruiter up represented the Army. He strolled to the lectern with a congenial smile on his face. He was a charismatic and engaging speaker, comforting and reassuring. He talked about how deployment to a war zone was unlikely at this time in history. He highlighted the amenities and the freedoms available to soldiers at Army bases. In short, his entire speech was dedicated to dispelling the notion that Army life was either difficult or dangerous. When the Army speech had concluded, the Navy recruiter jogged up to the lectern. He too was charismatic and engaging, and he smiled as he spoke. He said the Navy was even easier than the Army. In the Navy, you would never fight on the front line of a battlefield. In the Navy, you got to tour the world. In the Navy, unlike the Army, you would always have access to running water and toilets. Next up, the Air Force recruiter. She too smiled as she casually approached the lectern. Like the recruiters before her, she emphasized the ease of her particular branch of the service. Air Force life was so much safer than being on the front lines of a battlefield like in the Army, she said. And living on an Air Force base still connected to civilization was so much more convenient than being stuck out at sea for months at a time, as in the Navy. When her speech was concluded, there was, of course, only one branch of the military left. Its representative waited for the Air Force recruiter to return to her seat before he finally stood up at full attention. He marched to the lectern. His neatly pressed Marine uniform, replete with polished buttons, was immaculate. He stood at the lectern in silence, looking out at the assembled students. His chin rose up ever so slightly, so that he was actually literally looking down his nose at everyone in the auditorium, with eyes that could cut steel. After the silence of his stare had become almost unbearable, he finally, mercifully opened his mouth and began his recruiting speech, which consisted of one single sentence. "Ain't none of you good enough to be in my corps." He then marched back to his seat next to the other recruiters. Following the assembly, each of the recruiters set up a table to speak directly with the students interested in learning more about enlisting. 3 tables remained relatively devoid of students. One table had a line reaching back to the double doors of the auditorium, and I'll give you one guess as to which military recruiter was behind that table. It is somewhat counterintuitive, but human beings don't really want ease, at least not too much. Deep in our hearts, each of us hungers for a challenge because we desire to prove ourselves worthy of meeting that challenge. Every major religion in the world challenges its adherents to live up to values that are so difficult that they are destined to fail over and over again. Islam, for example, has al-Sirat, the hair-narrow bridge which every person must pass on the Yawm ad-Din to enter paradise. It is said that it is as thin as a hair and as sharp as the sharpest knife or sword. Christians can quote the words of Jesus, who made a similar remark in the Gospel of Matthew. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. The Katha Upanishad, a holy text of the Hindus, states, like the sharp edge of a razor is the path. Narrow it is and difficult to tread. The Jews have their Mosaic Law comprised of 613 different commands. Buddhists have the Eightfold Path. You get the idea. The collective wisdom of the world's religions agree. The path to right living is a narrow one. It is hard to find, harder to travel, and most will never traverse it successfully. Religions worth following all prescribe a way of life that requires challenge, sacrifice, danger, and living for more than just your own self-interest. No religion advocates for a self-absorbed, unexamined life with no code of conduct and no accountability. In this regard, Unitarian Universalism is no different. It, too, is a narrow path, perhaps the narrowest of all. This morning, I'd like to offer you 3 short reasons why Unitarian Universalism is such a narrow and difficult path. First, we are a covenantal faith. We are bound to one another by a set of mutual promises, many sets of mutual promises, actually. One important covenant within our faith includes our 7 principles, which are incredibly challenging if you haven't noticed. We have to recognize the inherent worth and dignity of every person. All our relations and interactions with people need to be compassionate. I likely violated every one of these principles just on my drive down here this morning. Sometimes when I consider how often I personally fail to embody these principles in my own life, I can easily get discouraged. Nevertheless, I refuse to stop striving because I recognize that the kinds of people I really respect in life, the people that I consider spiritual giants, by and large, their lives are characterized by an adherence to these principles. They embody the values represented in these principles. And so I will continue to strive to find a way to live and abide by these principles as well. A second reason Unitarian Universalism may be the narrowest path. We have no clearly defined authoritative text to direct our actions and decision making. If a fundamentalist Christian faces a moral dilemma or wants to know how they should stand on a given social or political issue, they can open up their Bible, and whatever it says, that's it. End of discussion. And as big as the Bible might be, it has a finite number of pages. What is the UU sacred text? Well, it's found in the Bible, and it's found in the Quran, and the Bhagavad Gita, and the Upanishads. It's the still small voice inside each of us. It's the shifting, cacophonous voice of our community. It's the song of the sparrow, the blossoming of a flower. It's literally everywhere. We do indeed have sacred scriptures, but ours have no covers, no beginning or end, either in time or space. For Unitarian Universalists, revelation is not sealed. And if that weren't bad enough, none of these sources are absolutely authoritative or binding, meaning that everything must still pass through the filter of our individual moral conscience. As Unitarian Universalists, our conscience never gets a day off. We are never allowed to simply shrug our shoulders, pass the buck, and say, well, the book says this, So who am I to argue? Because we do not submit ourselves to any such absolute authority, we Unitarian Universalists can never defer personal responsibility for the moral implications and consequences of our individual choices. We are simply not afforded that luxury. A third reason our path is so narrow. We are committed to pluralism. And as Unitarian Universalist theologian James Luther Adams puts it, we are intentionally inclusive of dissent. Most religions are comprised of like-minded people who come together and choose to agree upon a prescribed method of worship for a specifically named deity who has revealed their will through a recognized prophet or book. You don't even agree whether God even exists. Nor should we. Yet, we worship together. We believe that the power of love is strong enough to keep us together despite our differences of theology and philosophy. It can be exceedingly difficult to live open and authentic lives in community with people who disagree so strongly and so fundamentally with our most cherished personal beliefs. Wars are fought over such disagreements. Yet we choose to find a way to make it work. Unitarian Universalism stands as a testament to the power of love and the capacity of human beings everywhere to accept one another with open arms, not just in spite of our differences, but because of them. And that right there is the difference between simply tolerating difference and actually celebrating diversity. No other church I know of attempts to live out this sort of radical inclusion or radical acceptance or radical love. But there comes a caveat with our liberal-minded celebration of pluralism and diversity. It involves a common misapplication of one of the theological foundations of our faith. You're perhaps familiar with it yourselves. How many of you have ever heard this said of Unitarian Universalism? Oh, UUs can believe whatever they want. If I could nominate just one statement or idea to be branded as heretical amongst UUs, it would be that one. No, Unitarian Universalists are not allowed to believe whatever they want, or say whatever they want, or think whatever they want, or act and live however they want. That is not what the term universalist in our name means. It doesn't mean that every idea, belief, or action in the universe is equally acceptable. Historically, that term simply meant that everyone in the entire universe was considered a child of God, was worthy of the love of God, and would therefore ultimately find redemption. And that's a big difference. I'm a parent myself, and let me tell you, there is a huge difference between me saying, I love all my children, and saying, everything my children do is fine by me. In an intentionally diverse faith tradition that values uncertainty, there is room to believe many things. Our religion is open to several different paths leading to ultimate truth and meaning. But believing there are many paths is not equivalent to believing all paths are right. I used to be a high school English teacher. Part of my job was teaching high school seniors how to interpret poetry. This was a daunting task because our system of education does such a wonderful job of training children to think concretely about language and embrace the idea that good communication involves words having one and only one definition at a time. I always made sure that the first poem I introduced to my students was one full of multiple meanings and open to multiple interpretations. My kids would read it, and immediately they would see the most obvious or superficial interpretation. Or it's about a child playing in a field. But then, eventually, after I introduced the concepts of symbolism, double entendre, metaphor, metonymy, and synecdoche, their eyes would begin to open. This could be a poem about a child. It could also be a poem more generally about innocence. Oh, but maybe it's not a child at all. Maybe it's about all humanity. Or is it actually a poem about gender roles in society? Is this girl possibly actually a transsexual? Is this poem actually about discovering one's own sexual or gender identity? By the end of the period, I can see light bulbs going on over their heads. It's incredibly gratifying. And they realize a poem can mean many things. There are many right answers. But then we come to day 2 of poetry. I again show the kids an ambiguous poem that is open to several meanings. I ask the kids to interpret it. And all hell breaks loose. Because young people are incredibly creative. This poem is about space aliens coming to Earth and harvesting human reproductive organs to create a race of half-alien and human babies that will grow up and infiltrate our society. And I must dutifully respond, I'm fairly sure that Tennyson did not intend anything like that. And more importantly, there's nothing in this poem that could reasonably imply any of that. Thus, a genuine, sincere search for meaning conducted in good faith cannot lead you to that conclusion. Now the student is shocked and outraged. But Mr. Baber, you told us yesterday that there are no wrong answers when it comes to interpreting poetry. Several years of teaching have prepared me for this response. And I have to reply, that is not what I said yesterday. I said yesterday there are many right ways to interpret a poem, but that is not the same thing as saying there are no wrong ways to interpret a poem. Indeed, there are many ways to rightly interpret a poem, but it's always a finite number. But the number of ways to misinterpret a poem is infinite, because wide is the path that leads to destruction. As Unitarian Universalists, we believe in many right paths, but we certainly do not believe all paths are right. So no, Unitarian Universalists are not allowed to believe and say and act out whatever they want. I personally cannot tell you individually how you should feel about your faith. I can only tell you how I feel about mine. And I can tell you that this faith means something to me. This faith saved me in a very real way. And I have chosen to make this faith the center of my identity. And I know that I am not the only one. And so when I hear a fellow Unitarian Universalist off the cuff say something like, oh, you can believe whatever they want, I cringe just a bit. It may not bother you to refer to your faith like that. But please remember, by saying these words, you are devaluing my faith too. You are devaluing the faith of the person seated next to you. So please remember, as a faith community, we are an interconnected web. Our individual words and actions reverberate far beyond our own individual experience. Being a good Unitarian Universalist is one of the hardest, most challenging things I have ever chosen to do. And it's also one of the most rewarding things I have ever chosen to do. The kind of pride that a Marine takes in the Corps is the same kind of pride I take in being a Unitarian Universalist. This chalice means something to me. To follow the path represented by this symbol, it takes pride, it takes dedication, it takes grit, it takes sacrifice, because ours is not a faith for the faint of heart. So my call to action this morning is actually just a question. Will you accept the challenge? Will you choose to walk this narrowest of paths? The road is long, but I promise you the rewards are great. And perhaps most importantly, you will not walk it alone. You can look around yourselves and see that you are surrounded by a loving community that is prepared to undertake the journey with you. We will uphold each other, push each other, pull each other, hold each other accountable, comfort each other when we fall. And each of us will fall. But together, as a community of faith, I believe we can and will meet that challenge. And honestly, for the sake of the world, if not just ourselves, we must. Amen.